now, I am so happy that we have Marc Dones here somewhere.
Do I get there now?
You can start making your way to help further orient us to our task at hand. Marc is the CEO of the King County Regional Homelessness Authority, and he's going to they're going to give some inspiration and some more reality checks. Marc had already been working on the issue of homelessness for several years at the Massachusetts state level, but I first met them when they were at Spark, leading courses on racial equity in housing and homelessness. Marc took that work with them to the National Innovation Service, and in partnership with others, took the entire national homelessness establishment to task, helping to lead efforts around a national racial equity working group, making sure that all of us as national homeless organizations were centering race in our advocacy. Marc and the National Innovation Service also helped to staff the work of the National Coalition for Housing Justice, an overlapping group that was first focused on resisting the Trump administration's push for criminalization and against housing first, and then pushing to address the immediate threat of the pandemic and use it to get us further in the direction of housing justice and the human right to housing. Marc is equally adept at bringing tension to a room, forcing people not to look away at how white supremacy culture impacts every aspect of our work, and at breaking that tension with a joke cracked and a wide smile. Like that. Every time I hear Marc speak, I come away feeling smarter and better for the experience, and I'm so happy to share that experience with all of you now. So, Marc, hit us with some knowledge.
Good afternoon, everybody. I can already tell I'm in the right room because normally I have to say that twice. So thank you for being here today. I am honored to be here, and I hope that I am able to say some things that are helpful and or just provocative. I'm going to start with, I think a thing that like in this room doesn't need repeating, but like we should just say it all the time. Experiencing homelessness is not a crime. It's just not a crime. And it is profoundly disappointing to me as a person, as a policy wonk, and who's worked at a weird amount of levels. I just heard recap to have what I feel like is a conversation on repeat, right? And I want to start by just acknowledging that, right? For many of us, there's a lot of repetition in what we do, right? And it's like a half step forward, 6 steps back. And I think I'm going to talk about why some of that is. But I also think some of that, in candor, building off what, was said earlier, is that we have not done a good job defining reality and saying what is or is not a lie. And I want to start there because I was reminded, I'm already off script, but my comms director has a fun job. But I was reminded of, when I was watching the film clip, how during the Trump administration, a core part of my job became getting up on stage after HUD officials and being like, "Oh, those are all lies. Are we going to talk about that?" Like, literally, I remember one time I spoke after Marbit, a man who I have very few, professional nemesis, right? Like, I don't think that's an adult thing to have. But that man, well, I have also experienced homelessness. And let's just say, we all have done some things and you don't want to meet me someplace dark. But I remember being at an event for, I want to say it was The Hill. And he got up on stage, and they were smart because they did not put me on stage with him because I cannot control my face and we would have fought. But, he proceeded to say things that were, inflammatory, certainly, but bizarre in how obvious they were lies, right? And what was remarkable to me is that the moderator of the discussion didn't have the basic spine to say, well, that's not true. I mean, like just making up statistics, like just like whatever he felt like saying. They're just like, oh, that's so interesting. And so I got up there and had to be like, wow, what a weird experience we all just had in this room, because those were lies, right? Similarly, I remember like I was at like an NEH thing, I think, and Dr. Ben Carson was speaking. And yeah, that's the right reaction, right? Like when you hear his name, you're like, ooh, what a bummer. But you know, he got up and said, you know, there's no reason to talk about race in this country. We have to stop talking about race, that face. And, you know, and then went on to say, you know, we need to be grateful really because families like the Vanderbilts built this nation. And I got up there and I said, quick fact check, slaves built this nation. We should know that. It's in books. But I think that what is, you know, powerful about a conversation, particularly with attorneys, right, about what is true and what is not true, is that there is a moment in front of us where we frankly have an opportunity to get better at defining the truth. And so much of what is or is not persuasive communication is reality building, right? And I think that there is, and again, for the attorneys in the room, you know, particularly if you're litigators, you know that like, if you're gonna win the case, people have to share your reality, right? And it is not a question often of like, what really happened? It is a question of, can I pull folks towards, right, the space that I am operating inside of? And when I say this like this, you know, I feel like, particularly in the progressive space, there is a natural reaction to that is like, you know, well, what do you mean? Real is real, right? And so my degree is in psychiatric anthropology, and I have fortunately experienced psychosis a couple times. So the twinning of those things allows me to tell you real ain't shit. Like real is not a real thing at all, right? You have the great misfortune of being a social mammal with like a meat thing that is just a sort of making up all of like your reality at any given moment. And you will never, and I hate to say this to you because I know it's really important in progressive spaces, you will never know what's real. You just won't. It's not how you're like, you know, built. Like you are a meat thing processing stimuli and encoding that stimuli into representations that you may call sound or sight or taste or smell. But those things are made up too by your brain. You don't actually know what anything smells like, tastes like, looks like, and you never will. Everything about you is a story you've told yourself, a story that if you're lucky, your community affirms. But the question of reality is not one worth asking. It's been settled. And much of what we have failed to do in our pursuit of housing everyone in this nation is understanding that our relentless sort of reality-based, you know, strategies, it doesn't matter. Because at the end of the day, any one of these people can get up on stage, lie, and leave. There's no accountability. There's no interest in accountability. There's like very polite applause and it's over. And I think that it's time for us to recognize that like fundamentally, we are hardwired for a story. And if we don't figure out what our story is, we are up a creek. And the reason why I was in the back of the room like, hey, tell us, is because I've worked in this space for about 15 years and I don't know what we do. I don't. It's a real bummer, but I can't tell you, right? Because what I know is that we don't really house people. Because if we were doing that, we wouldn't really be here. So there is a fundamental disconnect between what we talk about, the story we tell ourselves, and the basic reality that my lift took me past a very large encampment on the way here. So one thing has to be more true than the other, or we have to dispense with truth and make a decision about what we will make true. And one of the things that our, opponents, I did say nemesis already, so I guess I can lean into that language. One thing that our opponents have become very good at, much to, I think, our chagrin, is just letting reality go. I remember during the first Bush administration, which is, can you believe we had to do two of those? There was a lot of like, oh, this administration is so slippery with like what the truth is, right? And then during the second Bush administration, I think it was the Times that ran a piece, it was buried in there, right? And it was some interaction between a Bush official and the reporter. And the reporter said something along the lines of like, well, you're like, is that true, right? And this official had, I think, one of the most fascinating responses ever recorded and then lost immediately, which was to say, oh, I get it. You're part of like the reality-based crew. You don't understand that like we choose what reality is. And we can choose a reality and you can study that reality. You can create the statistics about that reality, write the reports about that reality for as long as you want. And when you bring them to us, it won't matter because we'll have moved on to a different reality. And I have spent 20 years obsessing about that quote because it was the most succinct description of what public policy really is that I have ever heard. And you all know, right? Again, if you are in the rooms where the decisions get made, like sometimes the decision happens and you're like, what is happening? Like, that was deeply arbitrary. But it is gonna be reality now. And there is a path we have that is fighting that, or there is a path we have that is embracing it and learning to outdream the other side. Because at the core, right, at the core of this entire operation, if you've heard me talk, you've probably heard me say this before, right? America is like a really weird fictional thing that we're all sort of agreeing to do together in various ways. But it's not real. A border isn't real. A nation isn't real. They're real things. But because we are committed, right, to this particular fiction, it is real. And in fact, right, like much of our policy around poverty is based in fiction. So I think about, for example, like the myth of the welfare queen, right? So like if you are not like familiar with this story, it's a fantastic story. I encourage you to read about it. But during Nixon or Reagan? Reagan, thank you. During the Reagan campaign, there was an incredible push, right, to create a narrative around everything, all the social programs that Democrats were in favor of, that they were all just like, money for fraud, right? And there was a Black woman at the time in Chicago who we know was some sort of scammer, right? Like that is true. Frankly, I mean, just between us gals, she was impressive at her scamming. Like my girl she had a Cadillac. She had like 6 different accounts with like, transitional assistance. And in fact, there's an excellent clip of her walking, like I think into court. and she says, well, I think I've done pretty well compared to some of you white people. And like energy, like that's the vibe. But, right, like she became the emblem. And she was Black, she was present, right? And so it was very easy for a racist nation to fixate on her against what was true, which was she was one person. And there has never been any evidence of widespread fraud in any social program this country has ever run. But that doesn't matter. Because as you know, almost everything HUD or Treasury, right, rolls out is riddled with first law and then regulation and then policy to guard against the imaginary fraudsters coming to get their money. And so I think if we can recognize that made up things make very real impacts, then the next thing we need to have in our back pocket is something that we're going to make up. And I, again, regret to tell you, I don't know what we stand for. What do we stand for? Is it that housing is a human right? Is it housing justice? Is it racial justice? Is it that, we shouldn't sweep encampments and we should offer shelter? Like, these are positions all well supported within our field, right? There is not a unifying voice that says, these are the basics. This is the thing. And I think in order for us to move forward, the time has come for us to make some decisions. What are we trying to do? And how do we dream it big enough that other people can see themselves inside of it? Because that's the other thing that I have learned, through my experience about people, is that progressives tend to do this thing where they appeal to the highest mind that a person has, which exists for about 35 seconds right after their alarm goes off, and then vanishes for the next 18 hours. None of us are any type of saint at all. In fact, right, like what you can count on people to be is incredibly self-interested at all costs, right? And so oftentimes when we advance these narratives that are about, well, this is about helping everyone, the polling on those narratives is quite clear. They don't resonate because what people want to know is, how will this help me? Thank you. And I know this is shitty. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that this is shitty. And I'm sorry that I'm here to tell you that I'm a Hobbesian, right? Life is nasty, short and brutish, right? And it can still be better than this. Because the neat thing about asking what this will do for me is that's actually what democracy is about. Right? Like democracy, if it's done well, if it's really doing the thing it's supposed to do, has space in it for everyone to be like, I deserve to have my stuff too. So rather than hearing that call for how does this help me and saying, well, you're a bad person, there does have to be some fundamental way that we understand that call is embedded in the structure of what this nation longs to be, and we need to answer it. In fact, leadership is less defined by sort of following what voters vote for and pulling voters towards what should be. And our nation has collapsed around the inability of leadership to recognize that leaders lead. Don't follow QAnon. Yesterday was a mess. Sorry. And in part, right, like I know some of this because watching all those folks talk about race and racism and homelessness, I had a warm feeling because Eric knows, any of you who've worked with me know, I spent a good 4 years grappling with this whole field at the national level to say, it's the racism, my dogs. In fact, many of the points that people were like, oh, well, did you know this? I wrote this. And I don't need the credit. That's not the point, right? The point is, from Milwaukee to Atlanta, everybody was like, did you know it was the racism? That's leadership, right? Like, leadership is, where are we going together? I don't need to be involved when all is said and done, but we have to agree on a principle, on what we are going to collectively make true. And so I think that, that's the thing that I am anxious to consider with you all, right? Is, what are we going to make true? And to that point, I'm going to transition a little bit, because the making of truth for our nation is both a narrative exercise, and it's also an exercise in doing, right? You can't tell a story about nothing happening, right? There are some experimental writers who tried. It's very awful. It's very awful. So we are going to have to show up differently. And that showing up has to have different priorities, different, sort of focal points, and produce different results. Because, I hate to say it again, but like, it is unacceptable that people have to live outside. And so that means that every encampment is an indictment of what we're not doing. And that's inclusive of those of us who are in this room. We are not exempt from being called to do better. In fact, the thing, again, about doing stuff together is, you either do it all, you do the thing together, or you don't do it. It's a very sort of binary operation. And if you don't do it, then everybody has to hold part of that blame. And for so long, our strategy has been, they stopped us. They didn't let us. They wouldn't fund us. I don't think that's acceptable. Because people have to live outside. And I don't. And my obligation is to do better for them, not complain about what someone didn't give. So when we make that decision, which I hope is to come together and say, no one should live outside. And here are the things, which, by the way, it can just be that simple, right? Like, the goal can be, nobody lives outside. We don't need platforms and treatises. No one should live outside. That's the goal, right? And I think the thing about that goal is, I think it is something that the majority of people can see themselves inside of. And the majority of people can then begin to marshal their activity and their effort towards. One of the things I actually take as a good sign, albeit perverse in the way that we got there, is that, at least for my community, homelessness polls as the #1 issue people want solved. That's a good thing, right? Because for many years, back in 2011, when I tried to talk about, like, hey, there are young people who are outside, people were like, okay, that's not I don't care. Like, don't we have something else to do in this meeting? So the fact that the public, right, has caught up with what some of us have been talking about for 10, 20, 30 years, that's good. And so now we owe them solution architecture that we can implement and scale rapidly to demonstrate that this is solvable. We don't have to live in this reality. It is a choice. In King County, some of the work that I'm proud of that our team is doing, that was lifted up, not like directly, but like those same things. They're like, oh, you should do those things. I was like, oh, we're doing those things. So like we are building an emergency response style activation to homelessness, right? Where like we pull everybody together every day and say, who is outside? What is the barrier to helping them get inside? And how do we do that, right? We have, at least the authority has stepped away from any displacement-based strategy or sweep or whatever you want to call it. And so when we engage encampments, we say, do you want housing? And we have a portfolio of emergency housing, of permanent housing, right? Like we're just like, here are all the things that we can offer. Do these work for you? And if none of these work for you, help us understand what does, so we can go get it. We are really focused on a whole of community activation, right? So I can't afford for people to feel like, oh, it's their fault over there and I'm not part of the solution, nor can I say like those people are not doing the thing, so that's why we're at a standstill, right? So to that end, our emergency housing voucher program, which is one of the best in the nation, has relied on everybody getting those vouchers deployed and leased up, right? So that means that like all 3 housing authorities, the homelessness authority, over 80 providers and private landlords have all come to the table and said, okay, 1,300 permanent paths inside have to work. Like these cannot be underutilized. We cannot be returning these. These have to work. Those are the kinds of things that I think we already stand for, but we need to be clear about. And we need to be clear that when we're having our discussions, when we're sort of debating the nuances of policy, the litmus test about whether a conversation is worth our time should be, is this going to bring anybody inside? There are so many meetings I kill where I'm just like, I'm sorry, this isn't housing anyone. So this is actually not a conversation for me. Like, I like it, it's very interesting, but it's not my conversation to have because it's not going to house somebody. That's the focus we need to have. And the last thing I'll say, I'm trying to get you back on tip. The last thing I'll say is we actually know how to do this, right? We know how to do this. That's the other really heartbreaking thing is everybody's brilliant. All of you are brilliant. And if nobody knows, if nobody believes that we are brilliant, it is an echo chamber, right? And so I want us to step out of our own way, right? And really start making the things that we do simple, intelligible, understandable, quick, right? About actively and rapidly bringing people inside, about validating people's right to be concerned about some things, right? One of the things I say is like, again, and I say this as a person who's been hospitalized twice for being psychotic, right? It's kind of shitty to go to the store and someone is psychotic in the store. It's like not great. It's not a fun time, right? And also that person shouldn't have to experience psychosis outside of like, those two things can be true at the same time, right? And I feel like we're adult enough to hold that complexity. And so to hear people say, I was really alarmed by this, and to say like, that's fair. We need to do better. Let's go bring that person to the appropriate place without getting defensive, right? I will close in keeping with narrative with a story. I've told this story before, so if you've, again, if you've heard me talk about this before, I'm sorry. Many years ago, I was in Pittsburgh, and I was listening to a woman who was an artist talk about her experience of like running a studio out of her home. Black woman in Pittsburgh, in a neighborhood that like wasn't super great. And she does these really incredible large scale sculptures, right? And so there's always a moment when she has to sort of like disassemble the sculpture and bring it out to her yard and finish it, right? And her house is right in front of a bus stop for one of the elementary schools. And so over time, right, kids being kids, they would get off the bus and be like, what is she doing? What is that? Like, how do I get involved? And, and she was like, and I was not trying to run a camp. I don't have no kids. I don't want no kids. But like they just started wandering onto her lawn as kids do, right? And so eventually she finds herself basically like running a small arts camp. And so she's working on a sculpture one day, and a young person is coloring and is like, "Miss, should I use the red or the pink?" And she's, she's like, "I don't know how to tell this young person, like, this sculpture pays my water bill. I do not actually have time to talk to you about color theory or why you should choose red over pink." And so she looks at this young person and she says, "Sweetie, you just got to make a decision." And later on, like a week or so later, that same young person is talking to another young person who is having a meltdown about which color glitter to use. And the first young person says, "You just got to make a decision." And I lift that up as my close because it's that simple, right? Like, we can choose a better country than the one that we have. And in that choosing, we will make that reality. And then we got to act like it. Thank you.
Mark is open for a question or two, and then we'll transition to the next panel. So if anybody has anything, there's Mike.
One in the back.
I'll give it first. Hi. Oh, can you hear me? No. Can you hear me if I speak like this?
I think the mic is on.
Oh, you can hear me. Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I was curious how, when you went out to the encampments and made offers of housing, how did you build that portfolio and how did you create that supply of housing that would be available for those outreach efforts?
Oh, I just lease the hell out of things, which is not the best fiscal solution. Like, so public administrator hat on, buying is better than leasing. And also leasing is good if you need space, right? And there's a Steinbeck quote that I like a lot, which is like, now that you don't have to be perfect, maybe you can be good. And I think oftentimes when we are like working around the development of supply for folks to move into, we get real perseverate-y about like, but it's not perfect. And like, okay, it also doesn't have to be perfect. Like, I've never lived in the perfect apartment, right? Like, and that was never my requirement of a space. One day, if I become like a trillionaire, which I'm a socialist, so I don't think that's going to happen for me. But if that became an option, right, like maybe then I could have the perfect space. But I think we really need to focus on like, get the thing that someone can say yes to, right? So we lease a lot of hotels, motels. We also lease like former sorority houses, fraternity houses, right? Anything that's going to give me like 10 plus rooms to move with is in play. The other thing I will say about supply development, and this was also like sort of touched on in the film, is that we often don't approach things like a system. We beg for stuff. And I don't know why that, like, hold your head up. Like, if you deploy HUD, state, and local resources, the housing market exists because of you, not the other way around. And so like, we need to approach landlord. I mean, this is what we did, right? We called in private landlords and said, this is not a like, hear me. This is not a conversation about a unit. I want to know how many floors, how many hundreds of units I can bank with you to deploy, right? And that changes the conversation dramatically from the, can I please have a unit over here, right? So I think that, it's really important to one, like look at like what is available to lease and focus on properties that are going to allow for dignity, privacy, and care, right? Those are my standards. So dignity means, like it like we're not putting you in some sort of dilapidated, like falling apart, right? Like you are going to feel respected by the environment that you are in. Privacy, you gotta close the door. You gotta be able to close the door. Congregate shelter is a sin. I'm not even religious. But like, we will be judged around how long we allowed congregate shelter to exist, and I hope they are not kind. We do not deserve it. So you need to have a door, privacy, and then care means I need to be able to provide supports in that space, right? So like, for some of our spaces, I need to be able to run med management out of a room. So I need to know that I can do that from one space, right? Or I need to be able to designate that there is a case management office, right? So it's just making sure that the physical asset has the capacity for the care that you need to deploy, which from my perspective also means you need to tier your assets, right? So like, I look at spaces and determine whether or not they're going to be a low acuity, mid-range, or high acuity space, right? High acuity spaces, I'm looking for like max 10 rooms, right? I need to be able to run med management. I need to be able to have a certain staffing plan, right? Whereas low acuity, right? Like, again, that can be a whole apartment building. And because most folks, shockingly, most folks who are experiencing homelessness are fully prepared for independent living. So we all can assert that. And so like a lot of what we do is just saying like, okay, like you just need a place to live, right? While we help you sort some shit out, and off we go. So that's how I think about the asset cultivation and management. Again, buying is better, but if you don't have the money, just lease. Yes.
I appreciate everything you said about crafting a reality and all of that, because in this work, I really do feel like gaslit half the time. I feel like I want to be able to talk at step 10 and we can't even agree on step 1.
Yes.
And one of the biggest, I think, like myths or realities or whatever that I combat is that homelessness is natural, that there's nothing we can do, that there's always going to exist.
Yeah.
Like some people want this, some people, there's always something. And I just feel like banging my head against the wall saying like, this isn't natural. Like, so I guess what's advice on how to combat that thinking?
I mean, I think, the best way to combat, so just so for everyone, the question was, feeling really gaslit by the conversation sometimes. And in part by this narrative of, well, people want this. This is unavoidable. This is just the way things work, right? One, nothing works anyway. Like, we make things work. That is literally what we do as a species. We're like, oh, we so if you look at just statistically what is likely to happen, most of it is bad. And so we have built institutions to make sure that different things happen. Truly, right? Like letting just life happen to you, terrible plan. You will be eaten by something. And so our work is to ensure that those things that would naturally happen don't, right? So to that end, the idea of what is or is not natural, this is artifice. Explain the market to me, my dog. That's not a real thing. Every time someone is like, oh, well, here's a reality, I'm like, no, there is no such thing. Next question. Second, I think that so I, again, anthropologist. And so I live and breathe, what did people say? And recently, so I heavily modified our point in time count because the point in time count is garbage and I needed something that was usable. Hey, and the thing that was going to be usable was not the number. The number is never usable. Don't use the numbers. But what I attached to it instead was a heavy qualitative component, right? So we did over 500 oral histories with folks who are currently unsheltered, and then used that to develop typologies of okay, statistically, what did we hear? How often did we hear it, right? And then use that to model out the kinds of assets we would need to deploy in order to bring everybody inside, right? To that end, right? looking at, we have a significant population who are living in vehicles, subset living in RVs, right? When we modeled out how many folks wanted to continue to live in an RV permanently, it was less than 1%, right? So it's like, no, like there is a way to know what people want, called asking them, and then you can respond accordingly, right? But I think that like oftentimes this sort of like, oh, like this is what people want, this is the nature of things, is being said by people who have talked to exactly no one. So get an anthropologist. Like that's our whole vibe, talking to people. I need one more? If there's one more? Okay. I don't have to do one more. Okay. Oh, Jesus. I'll do two more. Okay, back there and then here.
Hello, hi. So when I think of like the abolition of homelessness or the ending of homelessness, I think of two things, racial capitalism and desirability. I think about how people who are experiencing homelessness are portrayed to us in a really terrifying way, right? We're shown inhumane conditions. We're shown in media people who are doing bad things or have done bad things that we should ignore, right? And I think that this motivates or like allows the exploitation of the entire working class, right? Because if people were not scared of being homeless, if people had housing security, they wouldn't work a lot of the jobs they do, service jobs, unsafe conditions. Amazon, the entire corporation, would not have its housing base if people were not scared of becoming homeless. And I think that like earlier we talked about the homeless services like movement or housing justice movement working with like the racial justice movement, but I've never seen conversations around homeless service workers kind of committing to anti-capitalism or the anti-capitalist movement. And I don't know, I think like I say all that to say, do you think that the abolition of homelessness is possible in a capitalist society?
I mean, I've been clear on my position and my economic belief. I will also say that like, and I don't mean to be Pollyanna, anything is possible in anything because it's all made up, right? So like, I don't like, let me just be frank, right? Like inside capitalist structures, there's tremendous money to be made in housing people. That's bank, right? And I know it because I now write some of those checks. So I'm like, we pay how much for what? For what? So to the extent that there is a way to house everyone inside capitalism, it's by deploying capitalism, right? Like let these people make their money and move on with your life. And I know that's like for those of us who like occupy a sort of principled stance about how we want to live and like what we want our praxis to be, I know that it can be uncomfortable. But my response to that discomfort is to say it is not less comfortable than being forced to live outside. So like I gotta make it work with what I have until I have something different. And I am not prepared to like suspend the operation that could house people because it doesn't sit inside an economic praxis that I think would be better, right? But I want to be clear, I agree with you that like, many of these things have to fundamentally change for us to like be better as a species. And it's, at the authority, we have been very clear that like worker wages are crazy. Like you cannot pay people this amount of money and ask them to do this complex and complicated and draining kind of work, right? So like we have a commitment towards, again, like within the system that we've got saying we must do better here. And I think that like, and I don't want to sound incrementalist, but I think that like it requires sort of a both and strategy. Those of us who are within the system have to operate on the day-to-day within the parameters of the system. Like we have to be able to identify the leverage points and deploy them so that we can rapidly house people. Those of us who are free to act outside the system, burn us down. Okay, last one.
It's gonna be quick because it wasn't 100% serious. And Dane County Regional Housing Authority. And homelessness.
No comment. Thank you all very much. I really appreciate the time. Have a wonderful conference. And please, you know, look up something. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Are you not smarter? Are you not better people for that?